Welcome to the February 8th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. I would ask for patience as we conduct our virtual meeting. There may be slight delays as we transition between speakers, presentations, and participants. If any participants have issues with the technology, please send a message to the moderator, Ray. We have 3 committee reports and 2 other discussion items on our agenda today. As usual, I would ask for a focus with each discussion to allow us to get through the entire agenda. I would ask the commissioners to hold all questions until the conclusion of all presentations and any public comments. Finally, please be recognized by the chairperson before speaking. Please note Commissioner Elder is absent and excused. Commissioner Miller will be leaving our meeting at 9:20. I will be leaving our meeting at 11, at which point Vice Chair Mann will take over chair duties. Starting off with public comment, we start every meeting with an opportunity for the public to comment on an item not contained on the agenda. We do not have any members of the public signed up to speak today. Moving on to consent. All items on the consent agenda are considered to be routine and are included to satisfy the time requirements for staff to complete review and deliver the request to the Planning Commission. These items will not be discussed today and instead will be deferred to a future meeting. I do believe we had one member of the public sign up for an item included on the consent agenda. Please note this will come back to a future agenda, at which time we'll discuss the case in full. That consent agenda item is case Z6821, located at 1624 Glenwood Avenue. This item was discussed at the January 27 Committee of the Whole meeting, where the committee voted unanimously to move the item to the full Planning Commission with no recommendation in order to allow the applicant time to revise the zoning conditions. The applicant has not submitted revised conditions at this time, but intends to in time for our next regular meeting. With that, I'd like to make a motion to place this item on the February 22nd Planning Commission meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Vice Chair Mann. Is there any other discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, as this is not the final disposition of the case, we will vote by a show of hands to move Z6821 to our February 22nd meeting. By show of hands, those in support? Any opposed? The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to committee report. Without objection, I'd like to reorder these items, moving TC 1121 to our first item to allow us to have Commissioner Miller, the Text Change Committee Chair, available for the discussion. Okay. Item D.2, TC 1121, parking minimums, maximums, and mitigations. This is a proposal to amend Part 10 of the Unified Development Ordinance to remove parking requirements in zoning categories and locations where mandatory parking is still required. It establishes parking maximums for some uses, expands mitigation requirements for projects that choose to exceed parking maximums, and requires long-term bicycle spaces in multi-unit residential developments. In addition, the proposal groups uses into categories based on intensity versus the current system of the site plan tiering, as described in the backup materials. Committee discussed this item at its November 1st, November 16, December 6th, and January 18th meetings, where the committee recommended unanimous approval. Text Change Committee Chair Miller, do you have anything to add before staff does a brief update?
Thank you, Chair Fox. I will allow for the staff to provide the presentation first and then see if there's a report thereafter.
Excellent. Did staff want to start with a brief update to TC 1121?
Yes, good morning. This is Jason Harden. I would ask, is there a desire for an overview of the ordinance or to focus more on the committee's discussion on the site plan tiering?
I'd recommend we focus on the site plan tiering. Chair Miller, do you agree as well?
I think that is fine. I have a quick summary. I know that some of the other members have reached out to me and asked for a small summary, so I have a quick one prepared I can do as well. So maybe I will send my committee report first anyway. That might help. As Chair Fox mentioned, this text change amends the UDO to accomplish the 4 primary objectives directed by the Council to remove the parking minimum requirements, establish maximum amounts, expand mitigation, and require long-term bicycle space in multi-unit living developments. Prior to this text change, when a property was being redeveloped, its site plan tier designation was based in part on its parking minimum requirements required by the UDO. Since this text change removes those parking minimums, we also created a new method of determining site plan tiering designations based on overall intensity of the use. There are now 3 categories of use intensity, A, B, and C, which are listed in the chart in this text change and will be described further by staff. In addition, the committee's key findings are as follows with respect to the parking minimums and maximums. When a property is required to provide a minimum number of parking spots, this causes non-drivers to have to subsidize the cost of those spots, either directly or indirectly. These government subsidies and incentives to drive cars and disincentives and added costs to non-drivers create a policy that encourages increased vehicle miles traveled citywide and negatively impacts carbon emissions, climate change, and increased stormwater runoff and other negative impacts from large areas of paved parking. They also increase the cost of housing and goods by requiring more land. Excessive demand for parking can be addressed through creation of new residential parking permit areas, adjusting on-street parking pricing, and providing additional public parking. We also included mandatory short and long-term bike parking in multi-family developments to increase bike ped access. As for creating new parking maximums, the committee determined at this time that the transit and pedestrian infrastructure is not yet sufficient to allow the city to drastically limit the amount of parking that a commercial property is allowed to provide. As a result, we included a framework for including parking maximums on certain commercial properties, but we set the current limits at those thresholds which are currently standard to the market. We also provided for expanded mitigation options if a commercial property owner needed to expand the parking provided. With that, I will hand it over to staff.
So Jason Harden again, I'll talk very briefly about a narrow aspect of this ordinance, which involves site plan tiering. The intent here is simply to focus on parking, but because the site plan tiering process has traditionally been tied to parking in that it used parking requirements as a factor, we want to make sure that there were no unintended side effects of the parking removal on site plan tiering. And very briefly, I'm sure most of you are really familiar with this, but that is the process for when a site plan application comes in. Depending on the size of it, the intensity of it, it's given a tier, which then triggers or does not trigger certain requirements, including certain infrastructure provisions. So a site plan tier 1 is the most simple and basic. It's equivalent to what once was called a plot plan development. It does not include many of those additional requirements. A site plan tier 2 does require more, and a tier 3, think of a larger project that includes the highest level of infrastructure and other requirements. So again, traditionally, parking provision, really irrespective of whether or not parking was actually provided or to what extent, it was used as a gauge of impact of a potential project and part of a factor in tiering. That only came into play, again, this is a pretty narrow element of site plans overall, only came into play for changes of use. And essentially how that worked was if there was a change of use that did not have significantly higher parking requirements, then essentially it was deemed to not have a significant impact overall and potentially would stay at a lower tier. So with the removal of parking requirements from the code, it meant that that potential exception would be removed. So after some thought, again, with the idea of simply holding constant the way we look at site plan tiering, we, staff and the committee, devised an approach that eliminates parking from the consideration, but essentially does the same thing by grouping uses into groups of intensity, which really do correlate with, say, car trips, which also correlates with parking. So it does the same thing in a way, frankly, that's a little bit less indirect than parking provision. The groups are 3 groups, and the highest, I guess, intensity group, things like retail and restaurant, and then lower down uses, office uses, and then residential uses at the lowest group. So if a plan that includes a change of use moves from one group to another, then that would determine the tiering. Also, if it involves a relatively small amount of space. So moving through these 5 bullets, if it's small amount of space, the use change doesn't matter, it would stay at a tier 1. If the change of use is within that same group, say office to office or warehouse to warehouse, tier 1. If they step down, you can imagine something that might go from a higher intensity group to a quote unquote lower one. Again, that would be a tier 1. Again, this is just thinking about those impacts and that being the connection or the nexus between when we can reasonably require infrastructure to be provided. The tier 2 and tier 3 comes in with changes of use when it's more than 10,000 square feet, and then it moves from a lower intensity group to one higher group. That's a tier 2. And if it goes all the way, if it's more than 25,000 square feet and it moves up, then it's a tier 3. And so that's a system. We looked at some recent real world examples that have come through the administrative review process and found that did indeed, in most cases, that I'm certain that at some point there will be an exception, but for the most part, it held constant, the tiering provisions. So that's really all that I have, unless there are some questions about that.
Thank you, Mr. Harden. I'll open it up if there are any questions or comments from commissioners. Seeing none, Commissioner Miller, I believe you might have had Commissioner Bennett, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chair Fox. Yes, I did. And this might be addressed in some of the revisions that the committee made to address some of the unintended consequences, but I just appreciate if you just kind of state it again, if so. So my concern is, I think I'm generally fine with this. My concern is about the impact of removing the parking minimums and having people parking on neighborhood streets, particularly as we're seeing more multifamily development being put in or really close to single family neighborhoods. So how does this address that?
Would staff like to answer that question?
Yes. So the primary means that the city has for addressing what you might call spillover parking, or what traditionally has been called spillover parking. Although, again, any parking space anywhere is public space and doesn't necessarily belong to any individual property owner. But understandably, there are sometimes concerns that arise when there's a higher, I guess, intensity use, as you provided the example, next to something lower intensity. Typically, downtown or schools or colleges are where that situation sometimes occurs. And traditionally, how the city's handled that has been a parking district that limits the time or ability for non-residents of that street to park there. And then for a fairly modest fee, gives a parking permit or allows residents, if they choose, they may not need or choose to purchase a parking permit, but allows them to purchase the parking permit that gives them the right to park on the street at all times. We've had a number of those in recent years. It is the ability of any neighborhood to request that from council. There have been a few approved in recent years, and they have the flexibility to be tailored to the particular situation. The hours where there's higher demand could vary. And so that is something that if and when any kind of conflicts arise, that a neighborhood or street can consider and approach the city as a request.
May I follow up, Chair Fox? Thank you, Jason. That seemed to address if there's a higher intensity commercial use next to a residential use. What if it's another residential use? So the like time limited parking wouldn't necessarily be relevant because these are residents who would be parking there all the time. Would people who live there have to buy a permit to be able to park? I'm trying to think if it's a neighborhood that's there already. Let's say a lower income neighborhood. And here comes a more dense neighborhood with no parking minimums and people are parking on the streets. Are you saying that there might be a situation where the people in the neighborhood would need to buy a permit in order to have parking?
Yes, I think that's possible, although potentially the variables involved in that are the cost of a parking permit. Theoretically, it could be made available to residents of a particular street or block face, depending on that permit district is drawn at any cost. That's a variable that the city could control and potentially could factor into that equation, the income of the residents. But again, I think that's part of the overall question or philosophical question involved in the change as a whole. One way of addressing that is to require buildings to contain their own parking, which does have the effect of addressing that potential conflict, but at the cost of, again, subsidizing driving, increasing rents for residents who don't own 2 cars or any cars. And there is a little bit of tension between the ability of people to always freely have parking in front of their house and these other goals. The parking permit districts are a way to potentially finesse that, but there are some competing goals at work in this question.
Okay, thank you.
I think, philosophically, you have to think about it, not that it's impossible for this ordinance to have impacts, but what is the weight of those impacts versus the weight of the current status quo in terms of the costs it's imposing on housing citywide in order to avoid some localized problems that might be more solved in a more targeted manner through curb parking management. I'll give an example near where I live off the Person Street Business District. When I first moved into the neighborhood, the business district was full of old pre-war buildings that had no parking. But it didn't really matter because they were all vacant and boarded up and abandoned. And so they didn't generate any parking. And then with changing times, they became full of trendy restaurants and bars. And all of a sudden they demanded a lot of parking. And the neighborhood wanted to do something about it. So the city invented a new parking management program. I think most people who live in that area would agree that having the business district vital and active and walkable amenities was a trade-off worth making. There were some adverse impacts to that, which is that curb parking became more scarce a block or two off of the business district. But through proper management and creation of new tools to manage the curb space, that problem has largely been dealt with. So similar here, I think that what this is doing is it's liberating and providing flexibility for new development to address the parking as it sees fit, not due to a legal mandate. If we find over time that there are some, and many neighborhoods have a lot of excess curb spaces. If you go through them, there's some people parked in the curb, but there's a lot of capacity there. If we start to see that capacity used up in a way that it starts negatively impacting quality of life in that neighborhood, the city has tools and programs available to address it in a targeted manner. But the current method of requiring parking in every development everywhere across the city is a very broad brush way to do it. I would also just say on the apartment dwelling thing, for a long time, it's in the ordinance for at least 14 years, the big multifamily buildings you've seen go up on Hillsborough Street and Cameron Village and downtown have had a parking requirement of 1 space per unit. Almost all of them have built more than that. They built more than the legal mandate because it was necessary to market the units, to get financing to build the building. So we shouldn't see this as a situation where all of a sudden everyone's going to stop building parking to support their new structure. What we did see some people take advantage of was a small incremental infill development on small sites where it's difficult to accommodate a parking deck. And we saw some of these sort of small developments in and around NC State where they could appeal to students, especially international students who want to live close to campus and weren't bringing a car with them, to either build small buildings with no parking or with maybe half the parking that would typically be required for a building of that size. To my knowledge, that hasn't created any significant change in parking conditions around those buildings because it's been small incremental infill. But again, I think the most important thing is we're using a very broad brush approach today to deal with this problem. And curb management provides much more targeted tools to deal with the problem where it exists without imposing excess costs where it does not exist.
Right, I'll just acknowledge we're about to lose Commissioner Miller. Were there any other questions or comments? Commissioner Miller, did you have another comment?
Just ready to make a motion?
Please go ahead.
I move to approve TC 1121 parking minimums, maximums, and mitigations. I do not see a draft motion, but that's okay. Do I need to merely to state that it's reasonable and in the public interest?
Yes, please.
Okay. And this text change is reasonable and in the public interest for the four primary objectives and reasons stated in the text change.
Thank you. And
Mr. York?
Mr. York?
Sorry, messed it up.
And if you would also add whether or not it's consistent with comprehensive plan.
This text change is consistent with the comprehensive plan as well.
Excellent, thank you. And did I see a second? Commissioner Rains?
Second.
Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Morning. Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Godinez?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
And Commissioner Rains?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to item D.1, this is the Capital North Corridor Plan. This is the result of a 2-year planning process to guide growth and public investments along Capitol Boulevard from I-440 to I-540. Commissioner Bennett?
Sorry to interrupt. I need to recuse myself from this discussion.
Excellent. Without objection, Commissioner Bennett is excused from item D1, the Capital North Corridor Plan. These proposed amendments to the 2030 Comprehensive Plan include CP2A21 and CP2B21, the addition of the new area plan and its boundaries for Capitol North in the area-specific guidance section, CP2C21 through CP2F21, changes to maps in the transportation section, including the street plan, planned transit facilities, planned bicycle facilities, planned interchanges and grade separations, and changes to map LU3, future land use map, and urban design form, map UD1, which are proposed to be delayed until recommended community investments take effect. Committee of the Whole discussed this item at its November 18th meeting, and it was included on the agenda for January 27 meeting, but was not discussed due to lack of time. The committee reports the item out without a recommendation. Vice Chair Mann, do you have anything to add? Vice Chair Mann, do you have anything to add?
No, I do not.
Okay. Staff would like to give a brief update focusing on the areas of concern as identified in the early discussion. I believe that would be focusing on CP2C21, the street plan.
Thank you, Chair Fox. This is John Anagnost. I did just want to have a couple slides to refresh everyone about the core recommendation of this study, which is to convert Capitol Boulevard into a multi-way boulevard between I-440 and I-540, which would basically have separate lanes for regional travel and local travel. Next slide, please. And so that means converting pretty much all the signalized intersections that exist currently on Capitol Boulevard to interchanges. Next slide, please. That would allow the regional lanes to bypass the cross streets. So that's basically, where a lot of these recommendations are extending from that core change to Capitol Boulevard itself. And a big part of that is to have parallel surface streets that serve local traffic in the surrounding area so that folks can travel around by vehicle or by walking and cycling without getting onto Capitol Boulevard itself. And so if we can advance to the later section of slides where we talk about the street plan amendments, I'd like to just get into the comments that we've received from property owners who would be affected by proposed street plan amendments to add new public streets in locations around Capitol Boulevard. And if we can actually skip ahead to the Huntley slide, we heard from a property owner, yep, that one there, of the Capitol Shops at the corner of Huntley and Capitol, that street, proposed public street, would be onerous for the property, and had proposed realigning it farther to access Huntley Drive farther to the north. Staff believes that this alignment is, from an engineering perspective, makes sense. Also, from a development perspective, does produce parcels that make appropriate development sites. And the thing that we really want to emphasize with all these changes is that when a street is proposed on the street plan, it is required if and when the property owner chooses to redevelop the property. And as you just heard about, the different site plan tiering is only required with significant redevelopment of a piece of property that takes you to the third tier of site plan. So, and this area is envisioned to have taller height and infill development that would be more dense than the current single-story retail that's here. So, just want to emphasize that this street would be required if these amendments are approved, but that would likely be accompanied by additional denser development. Next slide, please. On the other side of Capitol Boulevard, in a similar area, this is north of Trawick Road. We had a comment that this section, it would be difficult to construct. Staff believes it is possible to construct this segment, extending Stony Brook. Next slide, please. There is a speaker in the meeting today who is concerned about this property on the south side of Old Buffalo Road, where they would have to construct half of that public street on the west side of their property if they redevelop. Next slide, please. And then we have also heard from the owner of this chiropractic clinic that it would be difficult for them to construct this street. One thing I'll note about this particular segment is that this is emanating largely from the project to rebuild the I-440 interchange, which is being led by NCDOT, which is likely to envision interchanges like we're proposing in the Capitol North plan for Highwoods and Westinghouse Boulevards and Brentwood, and would include these square loop interchange designs that would allow folks to bypass those interchanges if they're just making a right turn. So we've largely put this in here because we expect that NCDOT might pursue this alignment. We didn't actually envision this property having significant redevelopment potential because almost the entirety of this area is in the 100-year floodplain or the floodway around Marsh Creek. So this is really coming from NCDOT. But those were the comments that I wanted to note. A few of those folks are on the line today to speak, and that's all I really have for the presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Anagnost. I do believe we may have a few members of the public signed up on this. Is that correct, moderator?
Yes, we currently have one speaker present.
Okay. We generally don't hear members of the public during committee reports. However, if it is the will of the commission, we can unmute speakers and hear them now. Just by show of hands, is anyone interested in hearing? And we have 1, 2, 3. I believe that gives us enough. Let's unmute the speaker and just note we'd ask you to not be repetitive of previous comments or comments that you've emailed to us, because I do assure you we have read those.
All right, Kirk Parker, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, my name is Kirk Parker. My address is P.O. Box 464. I'm here to speak on behalf of McGee Properties and Capitol Boulevard Shops, the owners of the property and improvements located at the corner of Huntley Drive and Capitol Boulevard. There are multiple buildings on this property. For reference, the address is 3023 Capitol Boulevard. The real estate ID is 0168442. I have several comments here to share with you, but in respect to your not repeating what I've already said, I will not voice those, but summarize it to say that we're in opposition to this component of this comp plan to have this street imposed on our property. There's too much uncertainty around the future development regarding the interchange, which will already, drastically impact our property. This property already has a private street on it that was not on a map anywhere at the time we developed this property in 1998. It was required as a condition of the city of Raleigh to develop the property, and we installed it at our expense. It provides cross access and circulation of traffic between all us and the neighboring property. The idea of putting a wider main street here just does not seem practical. There is a vacant lot on this property that could be developed, and we've had multiple discussions with different people over time about developing this property, and it's a question to me whether or not that would trigger having to install this street, which would then probably make it too costly and impose an undue burden in our opinion. Second, it's unlikely that this street as proposed would even go where it's proposed to go, given the taking of land and the construction engineering of the interchange, the massive interchange there. And so all we're saying is let's not impose something on a property owner when there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about what's going to happen for the major point of the comprehensive plan, which is to improve and to drastically change Capitol Boulevard. And in response to this comment, staff has said that they could gladly help us with the comprehensive plan amendment at such time, which really doesn't make sense when that's a much more arduous process, and in my understanding, than just going through the development approval process. So what I wanted to point out here is that last week during the committee as a whole, the Wake BRT Western Boulevard Corridor Study and Comprehensive Plan Amendment CP 1021 was discussed at length, and several people spoke in opposition to the street plan associated with it. In that case, amongst other things, there was a similar objection to ours in that the street plan called for a new street imposed on a shopping center that bisected the property and impacted its value as well as its ability to potentially renovate the property without triggering the need for the street. It was also discussed that it limited the property owner's ability to get financing. I understand that there are threshold levels of development required before the new street is a factor. I believe it was Commissioner Miller that talked about text amendments, text change, and so forth that could kind of alleviate this problem. But in the end, from my perspective, it was decided that it was potentially too confusing and somewhat arbitrary. And it was ultimately decided and moved and voted that by the committee that the plan be recommended and reported to the full planning commission. I guess that's how that works, but without the street plan. We would like you to consider the same thing in this case. In our view, this situation is similar, if not the same. Again, to repeat myself, our position is in opposition as it relates to our property. We think that this is very similar to the Wake BRT Western Boulevard case where the comp plan was approved, but without the street plan. And we would ask that you consider the same thing in this case. I appreciate your time. I do appreciate all the effort and time that goes into all of these endeavors. And that's it.
Thank you, sir, for your comments. Do we have any additional speakers signed up to address Capitol North Corridor Plan?
That's all we have present.
Thank you. So with that, going to acknowledge that perhaps the street plan conversation might be larger and require additional tools that we may not be able to address here in this forum. And I know some members may have additional comment, but I'd like to offer as one option a motion to approve the Capitol North Corridor Plan and adopt the associated comprehensive plan amendments as they are reasonable in the public interest, except I would like to pull out map T1 street plan CP2C21 and move that forward to the city council with no recommendation. Do I have a second? Commissioner Ram?
Second.
Commissioner Lampman?
Do we feel that sending the lack of the street plan with no recommendation to council gives council proper understanding of our position on why we are not including the street plan? I only bring that up in the sense of no recommendation is very vague. Do we have thoughts that we would like to convey with that?
You're welcome to add some at this point with a friendly amendment.
I would make a friendly amendment to deny the street plan, but I don't know if that's too strict for folks, so.
By show of hands, support for a denial motion for 2C21. Acknowledge this is not final disposition. This is just to get the motions in order. Do we have additional support to deny map CP 2C21, the street plan? I'm seeing Commissioner Godinez.
This is just for clarification, the map that the gentleman was just speaking on, correct?
Correct. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, so I support Commissioner Lampman's amendment.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, just for clarity of mixing motions, I'll briefly rescind my motion. Commissioner Lampman has made a motion to deny CP2C21, which is the proposed amendments to map T1, the street plan. Commissioner Godinez, would you like to offer a second?
Yes, I second the motion.
Okay. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Commissioner O'Haver?
Yep, sorry. Unfortunately, I missed the committee of the whole conversation. This is a lot to wrap my head around. So could someone help me figure out what we're just recommending to remove the one map that was just discussed, but approve the others, or we're sending that forward with no recommendation to council?
Commissioner Lampman just moments ago made a motion to deny CP2C21, the street plan. So that would effectively deny and not recommend approval of those recommendations on any of the street maps. So those are the dashed line maps that we often refer to. Just a really high level observation from the conversation at the committee of the whole. We've acknowledged in many of these areas that are going to see additional investment and development along corridors that have historically been auto-centric and auto-focused. We have a lot of strip malls along those areas with large parcels that might benefit from additional grid density. However, many of those strip malls are minority owned and contain businesses within them that serve the general population and often lower income residents. So that's my high level summary, not a judgment. Would you like any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion to deny the map T1 street plan?
Yeah, if I could, Chair Fox, can you help me understand why we voted out of the CAL without a recommendation as well?
I believe it was voted out without a recommendation to come up with some solutions to CP2C21. I believe the solution that's offered today is a recommended denial of that piece of the plan.
Thank you.
And just for clarification, we're approving everything else. It's just the dotted street plan. And, oh, Commissioner.
So what I recommend is you do this in two motions for clarity. So what we have on the table is your motion, seconded by Commissioner Godinez, for denial of CP2C21, the street plan.
May I make a comment?
Yes, you may.
I just want to note that there are several other proposed new public streets in the proposed amendment to the street plan. I just wanted the commission to be aware that even if this one segment is unacceptable to the commission, it seems, if I can speak candidly, drastic to recommend denial for something like a dozen other segments for which we have not received public comment.
Point taken. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits? Mr. Bowers?
Also wanted to note that there was the planned bicycle amendments recommend bike facilities on some of these streets. So if the recommended streets all go away, those planned bicycle facilities on those streets will also have to go away. And of course, one of our things could be, well, we just really don't care about bike connectivity, so that's fine. Or knowing that, we would have come up with other alternative routes. So I think I just want to put it out there again that there are some more moving parts here that are impacted. I would also just like to, I think at some point a larger discussion with the Planning Commission is necessary on sort of the first order question, which is, should the city be in the business of planning new street connections or not? Or should we just leave it to whatever the private sector builds? That's been much of the post-war history of the city. And, as a result, you can't get anywhere in North Raleigh without getting on one of the major streets, which is a real problem for our bike planning, because now we have to figure out how to retrofit bike facilities on giant roads like Six Forks, because none of the residential streets or collector streets line up with each other. And it is literally physically impossible to connect a direct route from point A to point B in any of these places on that road network. So it's been very contentious, the planning efforts we've done to try to correct some of this over time and to try to correct it through the means of redevelopment projects. And there's multiple tools that we have. One of them is the block perimeter standards, but a lot of small developments are exempt from that. One of the things that a map, street, and area plan does is it removes that exemption. So it's something that has to be talked about. There's been a lot of internal discussion with staff about how do we both get better connectivity over time in a way that doesn't burden property owners in the short term. And it's been a difficult thing to square. We've worked really hard on trying to develop the right policy language to try to get there. But I just want to throw these different things into the mix as it relates to this particular plan. But if the general thought of the commission is that we shouldn't map any new streets, then I mean that would save us a lot of effort on future area plans to not do that anymore. But I think that was certainly a decision to deny the entire map as it currently stands would be a sort of an affirmation of that position.
Point taken. Are there any additional comments? Commissioner Lampman, would you like, go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to, and Commissioner O'Haver, I think you were channeled in some of the discussion as well, when that was coming up, is that the dotted lines are proposed and they will only be implemented upon rezoning. And we were debating back and forth at that time, what triggers that rezoning, and then even to have that definition had implications throughout. So I feel in this particular discussion that we didn't really have, we haven't really come up with a good solution to these dotted lines that, could impact value that may or may not come to fruition. So I think Ken Bowers, your feedback there was important to hear. I don't have a good solution. I do have a motion on the table, so I don't know if we have to clear that one out or how we would like to approach it.
If we can, I believe we can. Commissioner O'Haver, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just generally, as y'all know, I have had concerns and expressed concerns about the dotted lines and their impacts. We've talked about this on multiple occasions. And I think some of the challenges for me are that those dotted lines are taken a little more literally than I think any of us would want them to be when applicants go through site plan, realizing that that's when those improvements are triggered. But a lot changes between now and whenever that strip mall goes through major redevelopment, and maybe that dashed line is not in the right place. So I'm a little conflicted because I agree with Ken. I think there is a role for the city to help plan future streets and future development. I just feel like currently how we're doing it is causing issue. And so I'm a little conflicted on how I'm supposed to vote on where we're going with this. So for whatever that's worth, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Haver. I share your concern. I do think the city does have a role. I do think grid density is important, especially in making something walkable. I will acknowledge the limitations of how that street plan map is interpreted, and how if you go to get funding to do a renovation, a significant renovation or rehab of a strip mall, the presence of the dashed line does affect how a lender looks at your application for funding. So I'm torn on that. Personally, I would recommend that piece get pushed through with the no recommendation, so as to allow further discussion at the council table. The council may choose at that time to address or pursue some options related to text changes in the block perimeter standards or some other mechanism by which to address how we get additional streets and additional grid density as development continues along these corridors. So back to the motion on the table. There is a motion that has been made by Commissioner Lampman to recommend denial of just the section CP 2C 21, which is the street plan. That's map T1. That motion was seconded by Commissioner Godinez. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of that motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members, and at the end, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
That's denial of the map.
Correct.
Okay, and give me the numbers again. CP
2C 21.
2C. Thank you. I'm sorry, Commissioner Dartell. How do you vote?
Nay.
Chair Fox,
Nay.
Commissioner Godinez,
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman,
Aye.
Vice Chairman,
Nay.
Commissioner O'Haver,
Nay.
Commissioner Raines.
Nay.
That motion does not pass. Moving back, I will put back on the table a motion to approve all elements of the Capital North Corridor Plan, save the street plan map that we've been conversing about. That piece would pull out with no recommendation. Other than that map CP2C21, all elements of the comprehensive plan amendments and the area plan itself are reasonable and in the public interest. Do I have a second?
This is the same one we initially, yes, I'll second again.
Okay. Is there any additional discussion or debate, Commissioner Raines?
Quick question, something that Deputy Director Bowers said about the bicycle facilities or the bicycle plan. And I don't know if transit facilities are also part of that or interlinked to that street plan. I don't know if we needed to address those with an amended item or not. That's my question for staff or Ken.
I don't think so, because you're leaving the outcome of those connections indeterminate and essentially saying that you want the council to take a coordinated look at it, but you're also recognizing that your time for review is, the clock has run out unless you get another time extension. I think it is also a very appropriate policy decision to put in front of the city council. So I don't think an amendment to the motion is necessary, because again, among the things the council would take into account in their deliberations would be the value of the connections shown on the bike plan map in determining, whether to remove some of these proposed streets from the other map, from T3.
All right, thank you.
Are there any additional questions or comments before I ask Janita for a roll call? Commissioner O'Haver?
Thanks, Chair Fox. So we're pulling that piece out, moving it forward with no recommendation. And our expectation is then that council is going to debate the merits of that exhibits and the impacts of the street plan.
Council can choose to do with the recommendation as they see fit.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Lampman?
How does this affect what John Aganos was saying about that there are other maps in there as well with the same implications? And furthermore, I think we'll be looking at this again on the Western Boulevards. So do we want to make a consistent broad stroke on all the street plans or just the one?
This motion only pulls out CP2C21 and moves that forward with no recommendation. The other maps, planned transit facilities, planned bicycle facilities, planned interchanges, and grade separations are included in the motion for approval, at which time the council reviews the street plan information. Staff may make recommendations at that time to alter some of the additional maps so they match. So you don't have a planned bicycle facility that doesn't match up with a roadway connection. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. If there's no additional discussion or debate about the motion, there's a motion on the table that I put forward and was seconded by Vice Chair Mann to approve the Capital North Corridor Plan and its comprehensive plan amendments, move those forward with a recommendation for approval, but pulling out CP2C21 and moving that part forward with no recommendation. I will ask Chinita at this point for a roll call of members, and at the end, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Dotell, how do you vote?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Godinez?
Nay.
Commissioner Lampman?
Alder nay as well. Thank you.
I'm sorry?
Nay, thank you.
Vice Chair Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Nay.
Commissioner Raines?
Aye.
Believe that motion passes on a 4-3. Moving on to item D.3, which is the Western Boulevard Corridor Study and Comprehensive Plan Amendment, CP 1021. This is the result of a 2-year planning process to guide growth and public investments along Western Boulevard from downtown Raleigh to Cary, and includes a series of improvements and recommendations, including CP 10A21, which are proposed policies and actions for a new area-specific guidance section for the Western Boulevard Corridor, CP 10B21, which amends the area plan map to include Western Boulevard study area boundary, CP 10C21, which includes new street sections proposed to enhance overall connectivity, eliminate gaps, and better connect the bus rapid transit corridor and surrounding neighborhoods, and CP 10D21, which includes new bikeway connections proposed to enhance the bike connectivity across the corridor and surrounding areas, promoting multimodal accessing and increased mobility choices. This item was discussed by the Committee of the Whole on November 18th, 2021 and January 27th, 2022. Committee is reporting the following items: the Western Boulevard Study Report and the Comprehensive Plan Amendments, CP 10A, CP 10B, CP 10D 21 to the Planning Commission with recommendation for approval. The Comprehensive Plan Amendment, CP 10C 21 Street Plan, is being reported out to the Planning Commission with no recommendation. Additional options for Planning Commission's consideration are included in our agenda materials. I'd like to
I believe we lost Chair Fox for a minute. I'll take over until she gets back. Staff, do you have a brief presentation that you're willing to provide this time?
Yes. Good morning, Chair and members of the Commission. Danya Sandeep with Planning and Development. I am happy to give a quick recap and overview of the discussions we had at the last 2 committee meetings on this item. This is the Wake BRT Western Boulevard Corridor Study and related comprehensive plan amendments packaged as CP 1021. Next. so as Commissioner Chair did mention, we had recommendations for approval for most of the items with the exception of the CP10 C21 street plan amendment. Again, very similar to the previous discussion we had on Capitol Boulevard, we did hear concerns about the two street connections that have received a lot of public concerns and comments, and I will quickly review those. A quick reminder that we do have a deadline of February 10th under the current time extension granted, and so if an action is not taken today, we would need to request additional time for review of this item. Next. So the two street connections, again, were contested relate to the Field Spring Lane connection as proposed by the Corridor Study and also the Plaza West Shopping Center located right at the junction of Western and Jones Franklin. Next. So I want to take a quick moment here because we had a lot of conversation with the public as well regarding concerns about street connections, and since the discussion we had at the committee, there was still some confusion about the timing and intent of street plan amendments, and so I just want to take this opportunity to clarify this for those who did not attend our previous discussions around this topic. But the street plan amendment that we proposed, the dash line, has been much debated, I know, recently, but this is a tool we've used, and through our area studies, we do that. We want to stress that there's no impact that these lines have on the subject property at this point of time. So if you have a single family use and you own the property and you decide that's what you want to do for a long time, that's what it's going to be, and there's no impact to that property until a future point of time when redevelopment or significant redevelopment triggering the Tier 3 site plan review process happens. And again, so there has been a lot of confusion about these lines intending that the city is going to construct streets or that's being funded. So I just want to clarify that is not true. This is just a way or tool to provide the basic foundation of street connectivity for a future scenario when properties redevelop for a higher density scenario. And we use this tool largely because it helps overall shape the connectivity and access, and it becomes much more critical to do that, especially in a scenario where we are planning for huge investments around the bus rapid transit project. And it's also a way to create some level of certainty and consistency. So we know as properties do redevelop incrementally over time, this is the only way we can ensure that we do have achieve a consistent level of streetscape. And also street types, when we designate on this map, we also designate the street type, which typically allows us to achieve the complete street principles of integrating sidewalks and bicycle connectivity, but also being applicable to the specific context of the area. So, and that's why we do pay attention and spend time looking at this, working closely with transportation staff to achieve that for, again, a more holistic look as to how we can better integrate neighborhoods to future transit investments. And and I think there's also discussion around parking and how we do want to reduce vehicle miles traveled just previously in the discussion around parking minimums. So again, here the point is that if we have well-connected streets, we are able to better manage traffic and reduce traffic congestion, but providing for additional mobility choices and routes for both pedestrians, bicyclists, and cars, and in the process create more walkable environment. Next. And so again, a reminder, we do have several comprehensive plan policies that do talk about connectivity. So it's, again, this is a tool we use, but tying back to why we do that is to essentially further some of these larger goals that we have as a city for enhancing connectivity, providing for multimodal design and eliminating gaps, and really avoiding the use of cul-de-sacs when and if where it can be avoided. Next. So the contested two segments are located within the Jones Franklin study area of the old. This was a study area plan we completed back almost a decade ago, and I want to highlight again the importance in the context of why we propose those. Again, there is a huge focus, and this is a recommendation just coming out of the study report, is the focus on creating a strong multimodal transit hub for this junction located right at Western and Jones Franklin. The study recognized that district is at the nexus of several transit modes, and so infrastructure improvements should be prioritized to strengthen the district's connectivity. Now, this is almost 10 years ago, but even at that point, we do have a lot of transit modes happening here, from the Triangle Transit to Raleigh Transit to Carrick Transit, all of which overlap in some extent, and so it becomes a crucial junction for that overall transit connectivity. Next. And I do want to highlight here, since almost a decade ago now, we do have huge investments in transit coming up, both from not just from the city, but from state and local and federal level, looking at transit investments through the Bus Rapid Transit Project. And the most recent study, which is the most recent recommendations in terms of land use that you can find for this area by the EDAT plan, you do see that W11 is a station, VFT station location right at the junction of that important area we've been talking and discussing a lot. And the recommendation is for an emerging urban center, and you can see recommendations call out for larger mixed-use centers of commercial and community activities. There's recommendations for up to 12 stories in the core area, which is actually the junction is right at the core. And again, providing for property transitions as they go towards neighborhoods. And in some contexts, this could also support up to 20 stories if appropriate. Next. Oh, excuse me, back. Okay, there. So just a quick again, we debated and discussed a lot. So I'm going to just this is more of a reminder. So the first contested street connection relates to the Field Spring Lane neighborhood. Again, on the map, you see the little star shows the proposed new street connection. And again, we talked about the context. So right at the junction of Western, the Jones Franklin and the new Western extension is where the proposed BRT stop is going to be. So you're really looking at the neighborhood and the cul-de-sac right off of a BRT bus rapid transit route. So the intent here was, with much discussion we had, is again, there's no showing these lines does not mean the city is going to construct or widen the street at this point of time. We absolutely have no funding or intent to do that. What we're doing here is providing a basic framework to frame that future growth scenario if it happens, and whenever that happens. And again, that will be triggered only by the property owner if they decide to make redevelopment happen in this area, leveraging on the future transit opportunities that may open up. So the street connection is really to provide that gridding of that area where you see currently there's this Field Spring Lane existing segment that just comes off of the BRT route, and it is a cul-de-sac. All of those properties are currently zoned R6, and we do have at the very end of the cul-de-sac is a senior senior housing apartment that, again, I want to note that is an R6 property, and the density on this property is about 2.65 acres, and we have about 33 units there, which the existing density is beyond R6 or what the current entitlement is. So, and they have about, it's legally binding affordable housing, so they have about 4 to 5 years remaining on the properties. Again, laying the framework, we think it's great opportunity that if should properties rezone and redevelop for additional affordable housing in the future, we absolutely think it's important to provide for adequate street connections that would also provide pedestrian and bicycle connectivity between these neighborhoods and into the corridor. Again, it's important to alleviate additional future traffic, knowing that the BRT is going to be right on the front door of the neighborhood. So that's being much discussed. Next. So I do want to say that we did provide these options for that connection that's being debated. Again, you do have options to keep the recommendations as proposed, or you could downgrade it to an area-specific guidance map, so it would be removed from the T1 map, or you could just opt for a non-motorized connection, or the last option being remove it from entirety and not have any recommendations. So that's the options we have laid out for this specific segment. Next. Next, we want to move to the Plaza West. Again, that we heard a lot of comments and concerns, and we understand. Again, our intent here is to really provide the framework for, again, this is a key catalytic site, as the study called, market analysis called, some of the major shopping center sites which are currently developed for single family use. Sorry, not single family, but single use. These are ideal properties because they are right at the nexus of the BRT transit station and provides the opportunities for obviously taking on more transit supportive density. And so the recommendations, and we do want to remind commissioners that we do have the transit overlay district mapping process underway for both Western Corridor and the Southern corridors. And this is a site that was recommended for TOD overlay zoning. So we are looking at it at least identifying as a site with great opportunities for added density, for providing affordable housing, making use of the bonuses we have for affordable housing, and again, great mixed uses. So this is the initial proposal we had, and after much discussions with the property owner, we did, a transportation staff did make a recommendation for an altered, adjusted streets element. So I'm going to just show that. Next. So what we're proposing now is a tweaked, adjusted alignment for the shopping center, where we see that on this scenario, we would just have one impact, one or east-west connection that would impact this property, while the north-south would be aligned a little more with the existing Hunt Club lane right away. Next. So the options that we've laid out for this is to consider the adjusted amendment as proposed, or again, include the street connection down to the area specific guidance map, or the last option being remove the street and not approve it. So these are, I think that is a quick summary. But next, do you want to say we have next? I want to acknowledge Jason Myers from Transportation Planning, who's here, as well as Head Patel. And said, if you have further questions, or would, Jason is also prepared if you want to deep dive a little more into the two areas that I just gave a quick overview of.
Thanks, Danya, for your brief presentation. This is a matter that we've looked at extensively in Committee of the Whole. Is Commissioner Chair Fox back on? I'll let you drive.
I am. Thank you so much. Apologies, my Wi-Fi kind of knocked out for a second there. I do not believe we have any members of the public signed up to speak on this. Can the moderator correct me?
We have one.
Okay. If we would like to, by show of hands, are commissioners interested in hearing comments? This one, I'm not able to see everyone. And okay, can we unmute the speaker?
Speaker is Steve Gerganis.
Greetings, Chair Fox and members of the commission. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, we can.
Very good. I'm a land planner with Womble Bond Dickinson. We represent the client, the property owner, and their management company. I'm at 555 Fayetteville Street, Suite 1100 with Womble. I'm not an attorney, but a land planner there. As a planner, I support multimodal mobility and accessibility. Here, the purpose and need is really to drive the TOD and high density development to support the BRT. It differs a little bit from Hillsborough Street. I understand that, and we do not oppose the plan. Here is very different from the much more urbanizing corridors closer to downtown and inside the Beltline, certainly such as along Hillsborough Street. A lot of the density, you could put a lot of the density and entitlement here now, but I don't believe that it would lead to that in the foreseeable future. even a 15 to 20-year period. When we spoke with staff, they identified a 30-year planning horizon for this. Here we have a property, as I've mentioned prior, that was built in 1985, is pretty well maintained, but does need some improvements, some refreshing, and perhaps some minor expansion. We are very concerned that a modest expansion would lead to a very awkward imposition of a main street through the property. It feels very, very difficult. It's difficult to understand how that would happen. It does feel a bit arbitrary in that there are several other larger TOD sites in the plan, including one that is dark now and larger and open for redevelopment, that does not have any streets imposed through the center of it. And we would far rather prefer and support a trigger or threshold, something that would go beyond what the existing entitlement is at that time. One other comment is that while the previous area plan in this area was done 10 or 11 years ago, it still seems pretty fresh. There has not been a whole lot of change in here in that time, and that actually presents a suitable option for this site. So thank you for your consideration. Again, we don't support the street through this site, and far prefer, at this time in any case, and far prefer a trigger or threshold to make that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Gerganis. Do we have any additional speakers?
No, just the one.
Okay, I'll move it for questions or comments from commissioners. Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. I'll just restate my concerns from the Committee of the Whole meeting. I'm concerned about the dotted line. I respectfully disagree with staff that it doesn't have an impact until redevelopment, or that the impacts are implied. I spent a lot of time looking at this. I spent a lot of time talking to people. And I spent a lot of time reviewing the MAP Act case with NCDOT. These lines do have an impact. They do affect how lenders look at the value of your property when you want to make improvements on it. That's a very direct impact, and that concerns me. In some cases, courts have actually ruled those impacts as takings. I support the EDAP principles. I support BRT and doing what we need to do to make it successful. I support the greater good. I don't support the greater good at the expense of these property owners, particularly minority property owners or property owners serving primarily minority customers. I don't think that is in the public interest. The greater good, in my opinion, the public interest is not served when the greater good is borne on the backs of people who are underserved. That's been used a lot in the past in planning, and I think we're trying to rectify a lot of those wrongs now. I can't, the dotted lines are significant to me. They're a small piece of this, but it's significant to me. And I think we need to, as we're talking about advancing equity and our equity principles and our equity vision, we need to look at who we're hurting to further the greater good. So while this might be consistent with the comprehensive plan, in my opinion, it is not in the best interest of the public. So I can't support it with the dotted line in there.
Thank you for your comments, Commissioner Bennett. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Okay, seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion. I will start you off. I would like to make a motion. In this first one, I would recommend that we remove very specifically just the Field Spring connection and the Plaza West connection from the street map included in CP 10C21. Is there a second?
I'll second. Yeah, that's what we basically talked about at the committee of the whole. I'll second.
Thank you, sir. Okay. We have a motion to remove those two very specific street connections on that map. CP, whoops. In CP 1021, just very specifically, that's the 10C map. We have a second from Vice Chair Mann. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Commissioner Godinez?
Does this mean that, just for clarity, that when it's presented to council, that for this portion, it'll be no recommendation for those specific areas that were extracted?
No, what it does is it moves the map itself forward and recommends that those legs of the dashed lines are removed.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any additional discussion on the motion to remove those two portions, those two roadway connections? Okay, I'm going to ask Shanitha for a roll call of members, and at the end, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
And that was Field Springs and
the Plaza West connection.
Plaza West. Okay, thank you. Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
No, hold on, Mr. York, you had a question.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand the motion. This is a motion to amend or a motion to approve CP 10C with the removal of those two. That's
a motion to amend with the removal of those two.
okay. So you're not moving to approve or recommend approval on anything. You're just talking about amending the plan at this stage. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Aye. Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Godinez?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampney?
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Nay.
Commissioner Raines?
Aye.
I believe that motion passes on a 7-1. Did I get the count correct? That is an 8. Okay. 1 in opposition. Motion passes. Okay. Now moving on. With that map amended, is there a recommendation to approve the remainder of the study report itself and the remainder of the comprehensive plan amendments? If so, please state that your recommendation is reasonable and in the public interest. Commissioner Raines?
Thanks, Chair Fox. I'll muddle through this. I move to recommend approval of the Wake BRT Western Boulevard Corridor Study and a comprehensive plan amendment CP 10-21. It's in the, as amended, it's in the public interest. And it looks forward for positive development on that corridor.
Thank you. And do we have a second? Commissioner Bennett?
Second.
We have a motion on the table for the approval of the Wake BRT Western Boulevard Plan and the comprehensive plan amendments as amended at the table. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none. Oh, did I see a hand? Commissioner Lampman?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I'm a little bit torn on this because I feel like it's our motion here is not necessarily consistent with the last one where we're trying to indicate that maybe these street plannings are not that this is not the right format, the venue to put in the street map. So I just wanted to point out I'm a little bit conflicted on the consistency between this vote and the previous vote.
Thank you. Any additional comment before we move to the roll call of the vote? Okay, seeing none, Ms. Shanifa, can we have a roll call of members? And at the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett.
Aye.
Commissioner Dartell.
Aye.
Chair Fox.
Aye.
Commissioner Godinez.
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman.
Nay.
Vice Chairman.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver.
I'm also going to vote nay, but again, would just like to add that it's really more about the process and not what we're trying to accomplish here. I'm just similar to Commissioner Lampman. I want to be consistent with my previous vote. I think there's good to be done here, but I'm just not sure we're doing it the correct manner right now. Nay.
Commissioner Raines.
Aye.
The motion passes with 2 in opposition. All right, moving on to old business. There is one item listed under the old business portion of the agenda today. This item has been previously discussed and we have received presentations and heard from the public. So we will begin with a short update from staff focusing on the revisions to the request. This item E.1 is case number Z6121. It's a request to rezone approximately 1.05 acres on West Edenton Street from downtown mixed use 20 stories urban general to downtown mixed use 40 stories urban general conditional use. This case was discussed at the January 11, 2022 meeting and was deferred to allow for additional conversation with the neighbors and for the applicant to consider revised zoning conditions. The applicant has submitted those revised conditions, and I will ask for a brief update from JP Mansell.
Thank you, Chair Fox. One thing I will note just on this slide, Planning Commission deadline for action is March 12th, which means there's 2 meetings before that deadline. Just as a reminder, the site is at the corner of West Edenton Street and North Harrington Street. Quorum Center mixed-use building to the north. There's a couple of churches adjacent to the site to the east and west, and the Holiday Inn is located to the south. So the applicant did submit revised conditions. That was their so-called one bite at the apple. They have clarified in condition 4 that they will provide equipment along with space for the installation of a bike share station. So just a clarification there. And then added a new condition, condition 6, that requires a public art installation be installed prior to any certificate of occupancy being issued. The condition also requires a minimum size and requires some coordination with the Raleigh Arts Commission on the scope of that public art installation. The site is well served by transit currently, so 4 routes stop directly at the site, and there's I think a couple more in 2 to 3 block radius. The case is consistent with the comprehensive plan, the future land use map, and the urban form map. And that new condition brought DT 1.17 into the consistent column. Again, lots of consistent policies here, capitalizing on transit, greenhouse gas reduction, zoning for more housing, and then some urban design policies that specifically refer to the frontage that's included. There are no inconsistent policies and no outstanding issues. Again, your deadline for action is March 12th, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. We've previously heard from the public, and I do understand that the applicant is available should we have any questions. So I'd like to start off with any questions or comments from commissioners. Seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Bennett?
I'm sorry, Chair Fox, may I ask a question?
Sure, go right ahead.
I was, in a lot of the email communication that we received, there was discussion about the equitable development around transit principles and whether or not this rezoning is consistent with that. Could someone from staff just briefly talk about that? Because we saw conflicting emails. I think members of the public were using that to say it was inconsistent. And I believe the applicant sent us an email using it to say it was consistent. So I'd just like to hear staff's opinion.
Thank you. Staff available?
Yes, I can help answer that. So EDAT guidebook is sort of a specific planning study that was created around the to address future land use issues around the new BRT investment. And so in general, with these specific area studies, those studies are distilled into the comprehensive plan via the comprehensive plan amendments. And we review rezoning for consistency against the adopted policies within the comprehensive plan. And so based on the policies that were adopted into the comprehensive plan, staff didn't find any inconsistencies with that EDAT guidance.
Are there any follow-up questions or additional questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion. Please remember to be recognized before you make the motion, and the motion should cite comprehensive plan consistency and include a statement of why the request is reasonable and in the public interest. Commissioner Dato.
Thanks, Chair Fox. I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated February 8th, 2022, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. This action is reasonable and in the public interest because it would allow increased land use intensity in the urban core of Raleigh with high access to transit and employment opportunities.
Thank you. And do we have a second? Commissioner Rains?
Second.
Commissioner Datel has offered a motion to approve Z6121. Commissioner Rains has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Nay.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Godinez?
Nay.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Vice Chairman?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Rains?
Aye.
The motion passes 6-2. The two opposing votes would like to be on the record for a statement that I could bring forward to council. You can go ahead and do that. Commissioner Bennett?
I think for me, this was one where it came down again to the public interest. It's consistent with the comprehensive plan, but it just doesn't feel appropriate for 40 stories to be in that location. I think I was just swayed by some of the arguments that I heard from the churches and people who live in the area that 40 stories is just too much for that area.
Thank you. That's helpful. Anything else to add, Commissioner Godinez?
No, I think it was the citizen engagement on it.
Thank you very much. Okay. Moving on to new business. This request has not appeared on a previous Planning Commission agenda, and we will hear a full staff presentation and applicant presentation. Item is F.1, case number Z5421. This is a request to rezone approximately 11.28 acres on Lewisburg Road from residential 1, residential 6, and office mixed use 3 stories parkway frontage conditional use to residential mixed use 7 stories conditional use. I'd like to start with a staff presentation from John Anagnost.
Good morning. I apologize for the error on this first slide. This site is over 11 acres, not 1 acre. And we can go to the next slide and see the surrounding zoning. Is largely residential with some mixed use districts around Lewisburg Road, particularly as you move to the south towards New Hope Road, but near the site, primarily residential. Next slide, please. Here you can see the site. This aerial photo does a good job of showing the wooded areas to the north and south, which are mostly in the floodplain, as well as the east side of the site. There's a stream corridor that comes through this area. And then the west side of the site has a electric power utility easement that consumes a significant portion of that end of the site. And then the lowland area on the south side of Kyle Drive is a future City of Raleigh Park property. Next slide, please. Here you can see a little closer. So largely wooded on the site, and there would be primary tree conservation area required along the stream corridor on the east side of the site. Next slide, please. This is from Lewisburg Road looking towards the northeast. You can see that power line easement there. Next slide. This is looking more to the south from the north end of the site, so seeing the low area where the stream crosses the site. Next slide, please. And then this is from the Kyle Drive side to the east side or south side. This is an adjacent apartment directly west, and you can see the separation there from those apartments provided by the power line utility easement there. Next slide, please. And this is from Kyle Drive, so very wooded along Kyle Drive. Next slide. There are conditions offered with this request. It is a request for residential mixed use with 7-story height, but that height is then limited by a condition to 6 stories and 90 feet, and the total development is limited to 260 units. That comes out to an overall density of about 23 units per acre. So if the site was not encumbered by the stream corridor and the utility easement, 23 units per acre is something that you would typically see at a 3-story height. Is a generally attainable density. So the overall density they're proposing is similar to 3 stories, but because of those environmental and utility constraints, this would probably take some more height to achieve that. Some use is prohibited, and then a pedestrian connection is required between the internal circulation of the site and the greenway corridor that is contained within the stream corridor on the eastern end of the site, and then requiring where there is not primary tree conservation required along Lewisburg Road that the area be planted with a 25-foot landscape yard. Next slide, please. The future land use map here, excuse me, I wanted to note the greenway corridor is on the east side of the site in the stream corridor, and The applicant has not offered a condition to construct the Greenway Trail itself. I will note that Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources staff have stated that that would be a benefit to future residents of the site and facilitate the future extension of Greenway service in this area. Next slide, please. Okay, so here you can see the development breakdown. Again, the total density would be about 23 units per acre, according to the condition limiting the total number of units. If they were to open a new public street through this site, that would also enable a small amount of commercial uses at the corner of two public streets in the RX zoning. Next slide, please. So this area does not have transit service within walking distance. It's over half a mile away and on the other side of Lewisburg Road. So a little bit of a barrier to transit use. Also, sidewalks in this area are not very consistent and not many destinations that are accessible by walking or bicycle, but it would add more housing. Next slide, please. Here you can see that transit service. So again, New Hope Road over to Calvary Drive. Next slide, please. Again, adding a significant amount of housing units in comparison to the primary zoning on the site currently is residential 1, so very restrictive of housing, and this would enable quite a few additional housing units in all different residential building types. Next slide, please. This area does have a population. The census tract surrounding this site has a population that is generally has a higher proportion of people of color and folks who have low English proficiency and have less than a high school education. So potentially benefits for additional housing supply in this area. Next slide, please. This site has a single detached house on it that appears to be unoccupied at this time. So not really much land use history to speak of for this site. Next slide. The future land use map calls for moderate scale residential on this site. While the overall density that's proposed is pretty much in line with moderate scale residential, the height of 6 stories is a little bit outside of what that recommends, particularly if you look at the surrounding residential development, which does tend to be, it is a mix, does have single family, townhouse, and apartment in the surrounding area, but tends to be in the 2 to 3 story range. So 6 stories a bit out of scale, and moderate scale residential does say that new residential development should be in similar scale. So if this case is approved, it would trigger a future land use map amendment to medium scale residential to reflect that height. Next slide, please. Lewisburg Road is a parkway corridor at this location. The primary tree conservation area that's likely to be required, along with the landscape yard as required by the zoning condition, fulfills the recommendations of that corridor. I did note that the frontage policy from the comprehensive plan is inconsistent for this, even though it is supporting the urban form map. The frontage says it should be consistent urban form treatment, which to me suggests parkway frontage, as there are other parcels nearby mapped with the parkway frontage. And so for that to truly be consistent, we want the planting area that's required by the parkway frontage. Next slide, please. So overall, the request is consistent with the comprehensive plan, inconsistent with the future land use map, consistent with the urban form map. Next slide. And many of the consistent policies are related to housing and increasing access to the Greenway corridor. Next slide. And the future land use map and frontage being the inconsistent policies. Next slide. The zoning condition that requires the planted yard along Lewisburg Road did not note that that was in the absence of, or where primary tree conservation is not required. So I did note that that is an outstanding issue. The applicant, since the publication of this agenda, has provided signed conditions to clarify that particular condition. And so this case is prepared to move to City Council and schedule a public hearing. If you choose to take action today, we would include those signed revised documents as technical corrections to go with the application when it moves to City Council. So if you choose to act on the case as it is currently requested, you could do so without a delay for setting a public hearing. Next slide, please. And again, this would require an amendment to the future land use map to medium scale residential. And that's all I have. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Anagnost. Next, we will hear from the applicant team. The applicant and those in favor have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Chair Fox and members of the Planning Commission. I'm Matthew Carpenter with Parker Poe, 301 Fayetteville Street, here on behalf of the developer, Halley Building Group. Also with me this morning are Eric Rifkin with Halley and Chris Bostic with Kinley Horn, who's our civil engineer. Next slide, please. Before going into the zoning request, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Halley. Halley Building Group has over 40 years of construction and development experience and has developed quality projects across the Triangle over the years, including several in Raleigh. On the left is the Old Town project, which is a 515-acre planned residential community in Southeast Raleigh with apartments, townhomes, and single-family detached homes. And it's only 12 to 15 minutes away from downtown. You may remember it got zoning approval in 2018. And on the right is the Raleigh Beach project, which is under construction and will feature 420 apartments and 175 townhomes off New Bern Avenue. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And as John mentioned, the site fronts on Lewisburg Road, just north of the Capitol Boulevard and 401 Fork. And we believe the proposed multifamily use is compatible with existing development in the area. There's several apartment communities in this area, including Regency Park, Magnolia Grove, and the Winslow Park Apartments, which you can see called out on this slide. And there are also several future parks and greenways nearby. To the south of the property is the Kyle Drive property, which is a 27-acre property owned by the city and dedicated as conservation. It's planned for a future park, and I believe there was a plan drafted in 2010, but the city's still waiting on funding and a finalized plan for that. And then the future Greenway corridor is planned for the easternmost portion of the site, and it's planned that the Kyle Drive property to the south, across our site along the eastern portion, and then across Lewisburg Road to the north, which is also property owned by the city. And so, we're really surrounded here by future city park, greenways, and then the site constraints, which I'll talk about in a second. Next slide, please. And as John also mentioned, the site is currently split zoned from left to right. It's zoned R6, which you can see in yellow there. Most of the site is zoned R1, which is kind of the light blue color. And then to the right, we do have a portion that's zoned OX3 PKCU, which is shown in the darker blue color. Next slide, please. So the current future land use map designation is moderate scale residential, which contemplates townhomes and apartment communities. And I'll note that the property was designated moderate density residential until the recent comp plan amendment, CP 421, which was passed to implement the goals of the Missing Middle Housing Initiative. And what that amendment did was remove the density recommendation from the flume designation, and it focuses more on scale now and compatibility of scale to surrounding property. And I also know there are several properties nearby, mostly across Lewisburg Road, that are designated for high density residential. And these areas are shown in brown. These are mostly existing apartment complexes that are marked on the flume for additional density in the future. So, next slide, please. And as John mentioned, this site has several constraints which necessitate the additional height we're requesting. There are overhead power lines that cross the western portion of the site and an associated easement on the property. And they're kind of shown in green. You can kind of see the green lines there. And then the eastern portion of the property, that entire tax parcel actually is encumbered by floodplain, shown in pink. And so pursuant to the fairly recent text change TC 1620, which passed last year and becomes effective April 1st, there will be no development within the floodplain other than the city's greenway plans that are set to go through there. I also note that these constraints will sort of act as a buffer between the proposed development and adjacent uses. So because there will be no development in the floodplain, and because there can't be any development in the overhead power line easement, those will essentially act as 100-foot or greater buffers on each side of the property. So, there won't be any adjacent property line within 100 feet of the proposed building. So, next slide, please. We have proposed several conditions to help mitigate any negative effects of the project. We've limited certain uses, including some commercial uses. And I'll note there that we've intentionally not limited housing types, just in the event that this project doesn't go through for some reason, that there would be several different types of housing permitted there. We've limited total units to 260, which, as John mentioned, is consistent with a normal three-story apartment building, but because of the site constraints here, we're asking to go up slightly, which makes for a more efficient building and a more efficient complex. And we've also limited height to 6 stories and 90 feet. Next slide, please. So this is the condition that will require us to build internal sidewalks to connect to the future greenway along the eastern portion of the site. So when Kyle Drive Park and the greenways are completed, residents will be able to get on the greenway and head either north or south, south to cut the Kyle Drive Park property, or north to continue on the greenway to the north. And one of the reasons we were reluctant to build the greenway is we don't know for sure the timing of that extension. And so we felt it would be better to coordinate the construction of the entire greenway through there at once. Next slide, please. We've also committed to a 25-foot planted buffer along the property's Lewisburg Road frontage. And this condition goes to the spirit of the buffer envisioned by the Parkway Corridor designation. Even though there's several properties with Parkway frontage zoning along that corridor, there's really a lot of variability between whether buildings are up at the road or back from the road. And so, it's kind of to meet the vision of the Parkway Corridor, Parkway frontage, and also not be completely out of line with what's existing there now. And we did add recently the language in the first sentence there that just says in areas where primary TCA is not required, just to make clear that there could be primary TCA along Lewisburg Road, and that this buffer will be in areas where there's not TCA. Next slide, please. So to conclude, we believe this request will facilitate the development of needed housing in an area convenient to future parks and greenways. And we think the additional height will result in a more efficient site. So thank you for your time this morning, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Next, we will move to members of the public who've signed to speak up on this item.
We have one speaker, Steve Lai. Go ahead, Steve.
I'm sorry, Ray. I voted only because I had to vote. At this point, I have no judgment regarding this property.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Then I will shift and allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Do any commissioners have any questions or comments? Commissioner Mann?
I'd just like to hear from the applicant regarding zone condition number 4 about the plants in the tree conservation area. I didn't hear from them, and I heard from staff, but I just was wanting to hear their stand on that condition.
Thank you. Is the applicant available?
Yes. So That's the 25-foot buffer condition, Mr. Mann? Or just trying to make sure I'm following. Could we pull the
Staff,
presentation back up?
Yeah, bring up staff's presentation. I don't know if it was a 25-foot buffer or not. I don't think it was.
I'll just note it was actually condition number 5.
I'm sorry. Condition 5.
But that is the one about the planted buffer.
Yep. So the thinking there, Commissioner Mann, was to, kind of meet the vision of the parkway frontage there, which envisions a kind of planted buffer along Lewisburg Road as you head northeast. We purposely didn't commit to a 50-foot planted buffer because of our site constraints. So we're kind of tight there because of the utility easement and the floodplain on the eastern portion. And so, 25 foot we felt like was enough to give us an adequate buffer there and also leave us buildable area.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? I'll have one I'll put forward while you collect your thoughts. Just a question for the applicant while you're on the line. The 6-story designation is unusual and we don't often see that. It's kind of an in-between height. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to what your intention is with some of the programming of the building. Is there tuck under parking? Is there a podium that you're anticipating, or are you not there in the process yet?
I'd like Eric Rifkin to speak to that. Is he on?
Thank you, commissioners, and thank you, Matt. The 6-story designation is essentially about as tall as you can get with a wood frame construction. And so we're not talking about tuck under parking. We're not talking about multi-level podium. It could perhaps be a 1-level podium, which would also have residential units. But we don't have too many details because at this point we haven't designed the building. The 6 stories could all be wood frame, and given the topography of the site, which drops in excess of 10 feet from Lewisburg down to College Drive, that 6-story could be all wood as long as the floor area of the basement is less than 50% of the total building. So I hope that answers the question.
That does, thank you. That's very helpful. Are there any additional questions or comments from the commission? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. It's more of a comment than it is a question. I just have concerns about the height and the inconsistency with the with moderate scale residential as envisioned in the future land use map. So I'm struggling a little bit with that. Not so much the project itself, but just the height of it.
Has the applicant considered a 5-story height limit in this location?
We have considered a shorter height, but we think the additional height here, adds density that we need, and there are a few trade-offs, given the buffers, the 25-foot buffer on Lewisburg Road, the conservation uses that are surrounding, and the constraints on the east and west property lines that will act as buffers. So, even that 1 story really isn't going to make any difference to adjacent properties because there are those buffers and conservation areas, but it will add density in an efficient way because, the operation of a 5-story apartment complex is really not that different than a 6-story complex. And so there are kind of efficiencies of scale that you get with that additional height.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion. Commissioner O'Haver.
I move to adopt the proposed consistency statement dated February 8th, 2022, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. After considering the policies, maps, and other materials included as part of the comprehensive plan, I believe the proposed amendment is consistent with the comprehensive plan and other adopted plans. And while it is inconsistent with the future land use map, I believe it should be approved as I think it's compatible with the existing development pattern in the surrounding area, just providing additional connections to parks and open spaces. And while I agree with Ms. Bennett's concerns, I believe the 25-foot buffer and the constraints sort of offsets that additional story for an additional height. So I believe the future land use map should be amended. Well, I guess it doesn't need to be amended. It's moderate. It's just that it was inconsistent. So I believe it should still be approved due to those items I just mentioned.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Haver has offered a motion for approval of Z5421. Do we have a second? Commissioner Rains?
Second.
Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Janitha for a roll call of members. Mr. York?
I believe Commissioner Lampman had her hand up.
Oh, apologies. You are hiding on my screen. Commissioner Lampman?
That's okay. I think I'm difficult to see. I do feel that we typically don't see 6 stories in this type of area. And when I do think of stick construction, I usually think of it as being up to 5 stories. And furthermore, if we're giving an opportunity for 6 stories and only 25-foot buffer, I would think that it would make sense to offer at least a 50-foot buffer if you're going to go to 6 stories. So I'm more supportive of a 5-story with a 25-foot buffer. Just wanted to make a point. Thank you.
Thank you. Based on the comments of Commissioner Lampman, do Commissioner O'Haver or Commissioner Rains want to change their motion?
With all due respect to Commissioner Lampman, I think we'll just keep the current motion on the table and let's see. I could be open to recommending an additional, but for now I would leave it on the table.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I will ask Shanita for a roll call of members, and this is a motion from Commissioner O'Haver, seconded by Commissioner Rains, to approve case Z5421.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Nay.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Godinez?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Nay.
Nay. Vice Chair Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Rains?
Aye.
The motion passes 6-2. With that, it is 11:04. I apologize. I'm handing over the reins to Vice Chair Mann for the remainder of the meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chair Fox. That concludes the discussion part of our agenda. Next up is the approval of the minutes from our January 25th Planning Commission meeting, the January 27th Committee of the Whole meeting, and the January 27th Infrastructure and Mobility meetings. Do I have a motion to approve those? Okay. Motion to Commissioner Bennett. I'm sorry, Commissioner Bennett.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. On the minutes for the Infrastructure and Mobility Committee meeting, I just had one minor change. Near the bottom of the minutes where it says Chair Bennett asked if neighbors have any suggestions regarding stormwater runoff. I asked staff. So if we could just change neighbors to staff, then I'm okay with everything else. And I'll move that we approve the minutes from these 3 meetings with that change.
Thank you, Commissioner Bennett. Do we have a second? Commissioner Dattell, seconded.
Second.
Shanitha, can you take a roll call on the minutes?
Yes. Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dattell,
Aye.
Commissioner Godinez,
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman,
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann,
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver,
Aye.
Commissioner Raines.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Motion passes unanimously. At this time, are there any members that wish to give any updates or any comments before we move to the Deputy Planning Director? Commissioner Lampman?
Just a friendly reminder that our strategic planning committee is meeting on this Thursday at 4 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lampman. Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you. I just have a question for staff and maybe something that we can consider if it's not already being considered in a lot of the updates that are being done with community engagement. I was noticing on one of our staff reports today for one of our cases, it was noted that the rezoning was in an area with a higher percentage of people who speak English less than well, I think it's written, low English proficiency. And I'm just wondering if we see that, does that in any way get communicated to the applicant so they can perhaps tailor their involvement to ensure that those people who have low English proficiency are able to engage with the public meetings that are held for those cases?
I don't believe it does, but that's something we could have some internal discussion in and report back to you on.
Okay, thank you, Ken.
Thank you. Is there anything else to report from the commission? Seeing nothing. Mr. Bowers, ready for your report.
All right. Switch screens was unmuted or not unmuted. Now I'm unmuted. Okay. You reported out 3 items or 4 items last time to the council. So Falls Valley Drive, which is the text change to zoning condition, which is going to public hearing on March 1st. The other 2 rezonings, at Elvers Mill Road and Rock Drive and Pool Road, are going to public hearing on March 15th. The additional time you requested to review TC 1221, the accessory commercial units, was granted. So you now have a new deadline of March 21st. There's a number of cases you reported out a while ago that continue to percolate with some changes. Z6820 on Bagwell Avenue. It looks like the applicant's going to drop the requested height, but because of that, but they're also amending another condition in a less restrictive direction, so that has to be reheard. So they're going to be considering scheduling a new public hearing at an upcoming meeting. Council's asked for additional information on watershed policies for Z2121, so that's being held. And West Morgan Street, Z5221, is also being continued for some additional discussion with the neighbors on conditions. One other item that's not in the written report is just that the council will be at some point looking at a potential return to in-person meetings. And if that occurs, there'll probably be a discussion shortly thereafter about the Planning Commission's return to in-person meetings. Now the peak of the Omicron wave appears to be behind us, and caseloads and hospitalizations and other indicators are dropping. Don't know the status or timing, but just want to put it on your radar screen that will probably be coming up as a discussion item. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Bowers. Seeing no other comment or reports from the members, I believe this concludes our February 8th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. See you all next time. Everybody be safe, be blessed. Thank you.